All right, so now we're going to talk about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. You're also going to see a little recap of the water cycle, which you should have learned in where? Okay, but you also should have heard it, went over it in earth science. Okay, so organisms are 95% made up of just 4 elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And we've already seen this before when we talked about what? Macromolecules. Okay? Remember cho, chon, chon. Okay? You remember that? I know it's a long time ago, but cho, chon, chon. Remember carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Boom. See? Oh, you're golden. Look at that. That's the first stuff we learned.
I'm having to reach really far back.
Don't forget those things, because you're going to see those for sure. All right. So the supply of these, though, on Earth, of these specific elements, is finite. So what does finite mean? What is infinite? No limit. What about finite? There is a limit. Right, there you go. So the complete opposite.
N means no.
Say what?
N means no.
Right. Okay. So the major elements of life have to be recycled between ecosystems. So there are biogeochemical cycles, which we're going to talk about today, that pass the molecules around over and over again, because that is the whole purpose of a cycle. So some of the biogeochemical cycles include the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. So the first one that I'm going to just recap, because you have seen this before, is the water cycle. Okay, so you see these up here, which we just said. Remember that those are part of the building blocks in the macromolecules that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. So the water cycle provides organisms with H&O, because water is represented by what formula? H2O. Okay, so up here, we're going to go through the parts of the water cycle, and there are 4 major parts. Does anybody know what they are? Evaporation. That is one, but you're missing one.
Precipitation, evaporation, condensation,
Transpiration. There you go. Perfect. Okay. Runoff is part of it, and infiltration, but those are the 4 major parts. Okay. So first is evaporation, and this is how liquid water from bodies of water moves back into the atmosphere, and it does so as water vapor. Next is transpiration, which is very similar to evaporation, okay? Because it is evaporation, but it's coming from a plant leaf. Next is condensation. And condensation is when water vapor cools down to form water droplets in clouds. So you see condensation all the time. What are some examples that we might see here? Dew, cloud. There you go. That's a good one. Okay. What about on a cold water bottle? Like a cold water bottle, right?
How it mists on the inside.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then another really good one. Y'all wouldn't know this because you don't see me with this, but in my first period, I have to wear a clear face mask that you can see through. And so when I went over the water cycle in earth science, and I asked that same question, one of my students is like, "Your mask, Mrs. Ibarra," and I started laughing because that acts the same way as like a
Wait, you have like a face shield?
No, it's a legit mask, clear mask. I'll bring it next time and show you. All right. Next is precipitation. So this is what returns water from the atmosphere to the ground. Hopefully we'll get some snow here. I would love that. Does anybody like snow in here?
Yes, it's doubtful.
But it's gonna be bad when they
It's
take
gonna
us
be
out of
80
school
degrees
and we have to
Christmas
do
Eve.
online.
Pardon? Don't do that. We have snow.
Yeah.
Yeah, pardon, that's
Snow.
change, right? Yes.
Ask me in a second. Okay. All right. So here's what the water cycle looks like. And then into it, we can also add runoff and infiltration. Does anybody know the difference between those?
Runoff goes down.
So, yeah, infiltration, it goes into the ground, but then runoff is essentially what?
Back to the body of the water.
Right. So if the ground gets saturated, that's when eventually you would see runoff. And
We do
then,
like a water slide. We run off like a water slide. And they have water going down.
kinda. All right. So which process returns water to the earth through the atmosphere? Precipitation. Which process returns water to the atmosphere? Plant leaves have tiny pores. These pores help plants release water from their tissues. Okay. And so this would be part of what process? Transpiration. Okay. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, and this legit should be a complete review. So, the carbon cycle provides organisms with carbon. Okay. So, carbon is found in every living thing on Earth. So it can be in two different forms, carbon. And we've learned about both of these already. The first is in the form of carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is in the atmosphere. The next would be inside living organisms, which would be as sugar, which is known as glucose that we talked about. And that chemical formula is C6H12O6. So those are the two ways we see carbon, okay? So carbon dioxide is for what? What's it for though? Like who would use carbon dioxide?
Human.
Okay?
Oh, carbs.
Who would use it?
Use it.
Plants, okay? And then who uses glucose? Okay? So animals, but
Herbivores.
you're gonna do the water next week.
Food.
You're gonna see it next week.
Food.
We're gonna watch it.
Food.
Watch it, Laura.
Part of it.
Food.
Okay?
Yeah. I like food.
So, carbon dioxide obviously is not used by us because we do what with it? We breathe it out, okay? So, we're gonna go through how this works. So up here is a picture of the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle contains two processes, cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And we've already talked about both of these. So in cellular respiration, what goes in? Oxygen.
Wait, cellular. Oh.
What goes in? Oxygen and cellular respiration.
Sugar.
Oxygen and sugar, glucose, right? Okay. It'll come back, guys. It'll come back. Okay. Oxygen and glucose. And then what comes out? Carbon dioxide. What kind? And
Water.
water. Thank you. Okay. So in is oxygen and glucose, and out is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. How many?
32.
Nicely done. All right, then we've got the opposite, which is photosynthesis. Okay, and in photosynthesis, what goes in?
Water.
Water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. And what comes out? Glucose and oxygen. So it is the what of cellular respiration. They are opposites. The difference, and I've told you this since we did this, is the type of energy. Because a plant needs what? Sunlight. And our energy is it's food, which gets turned into what? ATP. Okay. So those are the differences. Everything else is the same. So they're opposite. So they are opposite processes that keep the amount of carbon in the air in check. Okay. And we're going to get more into this when we get into human impact. Okay. With some other things that we see up here like fossil fuels. So what words do you see in this term that might give you a clue as to what it means? Photo and synthesis. And photo means what? Light. And what does synthesis mean? To create, to make. Okay. So photo having to do with light, synthesis combining to make something else. Okay. So photosynthesis is how carbon is stored in plants as sugar. So carbon dioxide, okay, remember we said we see carbon in two forms. So carbon dioxide, and then we get glucose, sugar, okay? So this is what we are able to use as food because we don't use this, we use this, okay? So remember to, don't forget these terms up here. Reactants go where? And products come out. Remember my cake example, right? What goes in? You remember my cake example? What goes in?
Sugar.
Sugar, eggs, water, all the what? Ingredients. And then what comes out? The cake, which I just made a cake the other day. It was really good. Chocolate cake with cream cheese frosting. All right, so essentially, this is what we see, okay, for photosynthesis. So you've got your plant, okay, and your plant takes in what? Carbon dioxide, and what comes out? Oxygen. But then it also takes in what other things? Sunlight, that's its energy, and water, okay? And then it releases oxygen and makes what? What does it make? Huh? It releases oxygen and makes what? Glucose, because that's the food. Okay? All right, so now we're going to look at cellular respiration. So this is how carbon is released back into the atmosphere as CO2. So this is the exact opposite. So glucose is going where? And what's coming out? Carbon dioxide. So they're complete opposites. Once again, those are our two forms of carbon. All right, so let's look up here. We're going to determine whether this is photosynthesis or respiration. Which one makes sugar? Photosynthesis. Which one makes CO2? Uses sugar and uses CO2. Photosynthesis. Nicely done. Okay. All right. Tell me if it's sugar or carbon dioxide. Product of photosynthesis. Product of cellular respiration. Reactant of photosynthesis. And a reactant of cellular respiration. Sugar. Nicely done. So the carbon cycle is how carbon moves around in an ecosystem. So in cycles, nothing is created or destroyed. It is only changed, okay? So they are what goes into one comes out the other and vice versa, right? So this all coming back. I know it's been a while, but it's all coming back. All right. So carbon is added to the atmosphere by respiration. It's added to the environment by decomposition, okay, which is the breakdown of dead matter, which we just got done talking about. And then carbon from dead animals is then what is turned into fossil fuels. And we're going to get into this more when we get into human impact, okay? So in theory, these processes should balance each other out. But carbon can also be added to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, okay, which can come from factories. We also get CO2 from driving in the car. All right, so tell me if we're adding or removing CO2. You drive a car and burn fossil fuels. Adding. You perform cellular respiration. Adding. You plant a tree that performs photosynthesis. Removing. You breathe out. Adding. You plant a forest. Removing. Okay. All right. And last but not least is the nitrogen cycle. Okay. There's not a whole, well, there is really a whole lot to this, but not a whole lot that y'all need to know. This is actually a pretty complex cycle. So we're just going to do the basics. Okay. So we've already gone over C, H, and O. Okay. And C is added by what cycle? Where we get carbon? The carbon cycle. H and O are from the,
Oh, it's from the cellular. Wait, no.
what cycle?
Water
The water cycle. Okay. And then N is going to come from nitrogen cycle. Okay. So nitrogen is an important part of proteins and DNA. And we've talked about this back with macromolecules. And then also when we got into DNA and RNA and protein synthesis. So the air on Earth is made up of 78% nitrogen. But none of this is actually usable by plants. So nitrogen that we find in the atmosphere is not in a usable form. Okay. So there is a process known as nitrogen fixation. And this is what you need to know, okay? This is a process that turns nitrogen into a usable form so that it can be taken up by plants, which in turn, who eats plants? We do, okay? So this is what you need to know, okay? What nitrogen fixation is. And nitrogen fixation is essentially putting nitrogen into a usable form so that plants can take it in. Okay, this is the simple version of the nitrogen cycle. Okay, there's a lot of other pieces that go with it, like denitrification, nitrification, ammonification. Okay, there's a lot that deals with bacteria. So this is the key term. So the overuse of plant fertilizers has put a lot of nitrogen into the environment where it doesn't belong. So if there is excess nitrogen in oceans, okay, it leads to the formation of what is known as a dead zone, okay? And a dead zone is essentially there's no what? Well, there will be no life because what's not there for that life? Oxygen, okay? So this here shows us what happens. So fertilizer, sewage, and nutrients from farming flow down the rivers. The nutrients stimulate massive growth of what are known as algae blooms or algal blooms. Okay, so then the plankton and algae die. They sink to the bottom and then they decompose. So when this happens, it uses up the oxygen that's in the water. So then the areas become starved of oxygen. And so fish and other life try to avoid that because they can't get what they need to survive in those areas. So essentially, if a fish or other life goes there, they're going to die, okay? Does anybody